Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The dry wind howled through the desert, carrying with it the faint whisper of sand scraping against Kevlar. Private First Class Jake Wilkins adjusted his goggles and scanned the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dunes near FOB Forward Operating Base Rattler. Jake had always felt uneasy during these twilight hours. The desert, vast and silent, seemed alive with secrets. Tonight was no different. He and his squad Corporal Tony Ramirez, Specialist Ethan Hayes, and Sergeant Lisa Crow were on a routine patrol to secure the perimeter. "You see that?" Lisa suddenly asked, breaking the monotony of their quiet march. Her voice, though steady, carried an edge of uncertainty. "See what?" Tony replied, squinting in the direction Lisa was pointing. Far ahead, beyond the rolling dunes, a dark shape stood still against the fading light. It didn't move, yet it seemed alive, pulsating in the distance. "Probably just a shadow from the terrain," Ethan said, his voice dismissive. "Let's keep moving." Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a shadow. The way it stood, perfectly still yet menacing, made his skin crawl. As the group pressed forward, the shadow seemed to vanish, swallowed by the darkness of the approaching night. Back at the base, Jake couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen nor hadn't seen. Sitting in the mess hall, he overheard a conversation between two older soldiers, Staff Sergeant Andrews and Private Thompson. "You ever hear about the black shapes out there?" Andrews asked, his tone conspiratorial. Thompson shook his head. "Couple of years back," Andrews continued, "a whole squad went missing after reporting something similar. No bodies, no gear, it's gone. Locals say it's the jinn, spirits of the desert. Not friendly ones either." Jake's stomach tightened. Could the thing they saw be one of those spirits? Later that night, as Jake lay in his bunk, he struggled to sleep. The usual desert sounds, the hum of generators, the distant bark of a stray dog seemed muffled, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Suddenly, the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the base to experience power surges, but this felt different. Jake sat up, his heart pounding. Through the window, he saw it again, the shadow, standing motionless at the edge of the base, just beyond the barbed wire fence. He rubbed his eyes, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but when he looked again, it was closer. Jake bolted upright and shouted for the others. By the time they arrived, the shadow was gone, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. "What did you see?" Lisa asked, her hand resting on her holstered sidearm. Jake hesitated. It was that thing from the patrol, the shadow. It was right there, outside the fence. Ethan chuckled nervously. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Wilkins." But Jake could see the doubt in Ethan's eyes. He wasn't the only one who felt it. The desert wasn't empty. And whatever was out there was watching. The air was heavy with tension as the squad prepared for another patrol. Private Jake Wilkins could feel the unease radiating from his teammates, though no one dared to voice it. They had all heard his frantic story from the night before, and while most dismissed it as nerves, a creeping doubt lingered in their minds. Sergeant Lisa Crow rallied the group. "All right, listen up. We've got orders to sweep Sector Echo again. Keep sharp, and remember, we don't have time for ghost stories." Her tone was firm, but Jake noticed the way her hand hovered near her sidearm. The squad stepped out into the cool desert night. The stars were bright, but their light seemed faint against the oppressive darkness of the dunes. As they moved deeper into the desert, Jake kept his eyes locked on the horizon. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. Tony Ramirez, walking beside him, tried to lighten the mood. "Bet it's just some old equipment messing with your head, Jake. These deserts are full of weird crap." Jake wanted to believe them, but as the squad crested a dune, his heart stopped. "There it is," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Far ahead, the shadow stood again. This time it was closer than before. A shapeless, dark figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Do you see it?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Lisa raised her binoculars but frowned. "I don't see anything." Ethan Hayes, squinting into the distance, suddenly froze. "Wait, I see it now. What the hell is that?" The shadow didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Lisa signaled for the group to advance cautiously. As they approached, the shadow seemed to shift, growing larger and darker. The temperature dropped sharply, and Jake could see his breath fogging in the air. The radios crackled with static, drowning out Lisa's commands. Then, without warning, the shadow vanished. "What just happened?" Tony asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Turning quickly, they found nothing but empty desert. "It's playing with us," Jake muttered. Lisa gritted her teeth. "Stay focused. We're heading back to base, now." The journey back was worse than the approach. Every step felt heavier, the desert alive with unseen eyes. Faint whispers floated on the wind, growing louder and more distinct. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked, his face pale. "No one's talking," Lisa snapped, her voice unsteady. The whispers grew into distinct words, a language none of them recognized, yet it filled them with dread. Jake felt the weight of the dog tags hanging around his neck, as though something was pulling him back toward the shadow. By the time they reached the base, the squad was shaken but alive. The guards at the gate looked confused as the group stumbled in. "Trouble out there?" one asked. Lisa shook her head, but her clenched jaw told a different story. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the whispers, seeing the shadow in his mind. When he finally drifted off, it was only to be woken by Ethan's screams. Rushing to Ethan's bunk, Jake found him drenched in sweat, muttering incoherently about the shadow. "It was here," Ethan stammered. "It touched me." Jake's blood ran cold. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming for them. The barracks were eerily quiet the next morning. The usual hum of soldiers preparing for duty was replaced by hushed conversations and uneasy glances. Ethan Hayes sat on his bunk, staring at his trembling hands. His eyes darted to the shadows in the corners of the room, as if expecting them to move. Jake Wilkins approached him cautiously. "Ethan, you all right? Man, what happened last night?" Ethan looked up, his face pale. "It wasn't a dream, Jake. It had touched me, cold as death. It whispered things I can't understand, but I felt it inside my head." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. He sat next to Ethan, his voice low. "We've got to tell Sergeant Crow." Lisa Crow listened intently as Jake recounted Ethan's experience. Her face remained stoic, but Jake could see the tension in her eyes. "We're all under a lot of stress," she said. "The desert plays tricks on you, especially at night. But..." She hesitated, glancing at Ethan's trembling figure. "I'll file a report. Meanwhile, stay sharp and stick together." That evening, the squad gathered around a small fire outside the barracks. Tony Ramirez tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's just some local legend," he said. "You know, like those desert spirits or jinn the locals talk about." Jake frowned. "This isn't just some story, Tony. We all felt it out there. Ethan's not the only one seeing things." The group fell silent. Even Tony's usual bravado was gone. When night fell, the whispers began again. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. Then louder, carrying words that no one could understand but all instinctively feared. Lisa rallied the squad. "Everyone to the command post, now!" They moved quickly, the whispers following them, growing louder with each step. By the time they reached the post, The air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread. Inside, the radios were filled with static, the screens flickering. The base seemed deserted, the usual guards nowhere to be seen. "Where is everyone?" Tony asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The squad huddled together, weapons drawn, as the whispers turned into an ominous chant. A shadow moved across the far wall, darker than the pitch-black room. It seemed to ripple and shift, taking on a vaguely humanoid form. "It's here," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. The shadow stepped closer, its presence suffocating. Jake could feel his chest tighten, his breathing shallow. The chanting grew louder, a chorus of malevolent voices echoing in his mind. Lisa aimed her flashlight at the shadow, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. "Stay together," she commanded, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. The shadow paused, as if studying them. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it lunged. Chaos erupted. The squad fired wildly, bullets disappearing into the darkness without a sound. The shadow enveloped Ethan, and his screams were cut off abruptly. When the lights flickered back on, he was gone. The group stared at the empty spot where Ethan had been, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Jake looked at Lisa, his voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Lisa's face was pale, but her jaw was set. "We finished the mission. Whatever that thing is, it's tied to this place, and we're going to find out why." The loss of Ethan Hayes left the squad shaken but resolute. The following morning, Sergeant Lisa Crow gathered everyone for a briefing. "We're moving out," she announced. "There's a village marked on the maps about 5 clicks east of here. If we want answers, that's where we'll find them." The squad exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. Their fear of the unknown was now eclipsed by a need to end the terror stalking them. The trek to the village was silent, the oppressive desert heat doing little to dispel the chill that had settled in their bones. Jake Wilkins scanned the horizon, his rifle at the ready. Beside him, Tony Ramirez muttered under his breath. "What's that, Tony?" Jake asked. "Just a prayer," Tony replied. "Can't hurt, right?" Jake nodded, gripping his weapon tighter. When they reached the village, it was like stepping into a forgotten era. Crumbling stone houses lined narrow dirt paths, their windows dark and empty. A well sat in the center, its wooden frame warped with age. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something faintly metallic. Lisa signaled for the squad to spread out, check every building, look for anything documents, symbols, anything that might tell us what we're dealing with. Jake and Tony entered one of the larger houses. Inside, the walls were covered in faded drawings of human figures surrounded by black shapes. Jake felt his skin crawl. He studied them. "Looks like they've been fighting this thing for generations," Tony murmured. Jake nodded grimly. "And losing." Outside, Lisa found an old journal near the well. The pages were brittle, the writing barely legible. "The shadow takes those who stray," she read aloud. "It whispers lies and feeds on fear. Only fire can drive it away." "Fire," Tony echoed as he and Jake emerged from the house. "Great, and we're fresh out of flamethrowers." Lisa ignored him, flipping through the journal. Her expression darkened. "It says the shadow is bound to this land, feeding on the despair of those who wander here. It draws its strength from the well." Jake glanced at the well, his stomach turning. "So, what? We light the whole place up." Before Lisa could answer, a blood-curdling scream echoed from one of the houses. The squad ran toward the sound, finding Private Wilson standing in a corner, his eyes wide with terror. His hands were clawing at his throat as if choking on something unseen. Jake grabbed him, shaking him hard. "Wilson, snap out of it." Wilson's eyes focused for a moment, his lips forming a single word: "Run." Before anyone could react, the room darkened. Shadows spilled from the walls, coalescing into the familiar humanoid form. Lisa shouted, "Get him out of here." Jake and Tony dragged Wilson outside as the shadow followed, its movements unnaturally smooth. The squad opened fire, but the bullets had no effect. "Fall back," Lisa ordered, grabbing the journal and a nearby lantern. As they retreated to the center of the village, the shadow seemed to toy with them, appearing and disappearing at the edges of their vision. Lisa lit the lantern, holding it high. "Fire," she yelled. "It's the only way." Jake grabbed a piece of wood from a crumbling fence and set it alight. He swung the makeshift torch at the shadow, which recoiled with an otherworldly shriek. "It's working," he yelled. The squad formed a circle, torches blazing. The shadow circled them, hissing and writhing, but it couldn't break through the fiery barrier. Lisa's voice was steady but urgent. "We've got to end this. If the journal's right, the well is the key. We light it up, we might have a chance." Tony hesitated. "And if it's wrong? Then we're out of options." Lisa replied, her gaze unwavering. Jake nodded, gripping his torch tightly. "Let's do it." As they approached the well, the shadow grew more aggressive, slamming against the fiery barrier with increasing force. The squad moved quickly, pouring fuel from their packs into the dark depths of the well. Lisa took a deep breath, then tossed her torch inside. The explosion was immediate. Flames erupted from the well, casting the village in an eerie, flickering light. The shadow let out a deafening scream, its form twisting and collapsing into the fire. The squad watched in stunned silence as the flames consumed the well. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by an almost serene stillness. Lisa lowered her torch, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over," or so they thought. The squad's momentary relief after destroying the well was short-lived. The village lay in ruins, its eerie silence only interrupted by the crackling embers of the smoldering well. Lisa Crow gathered the squad around the dim light of a remaining torch. "Stay alert," she said. "We might have stopped whatever was in the well, but we're not out of this yet." Jake Wilkins looked around uneasily. "Then why does it feel like we've just poked a sleeping bear?" As the squad prepared to leave the village, Private Tony Ramirez noticed something on the ground. A dark stain was spreading from the edge of the well, snaking like tendrils across the cracked earth. Sergeant," Tony called out, pointing to the ground. The squad turned to see the black tendrils pulsing, growing toward their feet. Suddenly, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the well. "Move, now," Lisa yelled. The squad sprinted out of the village, the ground trembling beneath their boots. Jake glanced back, his heart sinking as he saw a massive, shadowy figure rising from the well, its form far more monstrous than before. "It's not just a shadow anymore," Jake muttered. "It's something else." The squad made it back to the desert outskirts, their breath labored and panic rising. Lisa halted them by a cluster of rocks, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "Listen up," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We've got to call for an evac. Whatever that thing is, it's not staying in that village." Private Wilson, still shaken from his earlier encounter, stammered, "What if it follows us back to base?" Lisa hesitated. She didn't have an answer. Jake adjusted his rifle. "Then we make sure it doesn't." The radio crackled as Lisa called for extraction. "Base, this is Delta Squad. Immediate evac requested. Coordinates to follow." The response was static at first, then a distorted voice cut through. "Acknowledged. ETA, 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Tony groaned. "We might not have to." Lisa glared at him. "Keep it together. We hold the line until they get here." As they waited, the shadowy figure grew closer, its shape shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. It moved with purpose, almost as if it were stalking them. The air around them grew colder, and whispers filled the silence, disjointed, unintelligible voices that gnawed at their sanity. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. It's trying to mess with our heads. Tony, gripping his rifle tightly, muttered, "Well, it's doing a damn good job." The first attack came suddenly. The shadow darted forward, striking with a tendril of darkness that slammed into the rocks, scattering the squad. Jake fired his rifle, but the bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. "Bullets don't work," he yelled. Lisa held up her torch. "Keep it at bay. Use the fire." Tony grabbed a piece of cloth and wrapped it around his bayonet, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. The makeshift torch blazed brightly, and when he thrust it at the shadow, it recoiled with a pained screech. "It hates fire," Tony shouted. The squad formed a circle, their torches creating a barrier of light. The shadow prowled at the edges, testing their defenses. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams that echoed in their minds. Wilson dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Jake grabbed him, shaking him hard. "Stay with us. Wilson, we need you." Lisa's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your ground. We just need to last a few more minutes." The shadow made another move, lashing out with multiple tendrils. One knocked Tony to the ground, extinguishing his torch. The creature lunged toward him, but Jake was faster, throwing his own torch to drive it back. "Get up, Tony," Jake yelled, pulling him to his feet. The sound of helicopter blades in the distance brought a wave of relief. The evac chopper was finally arriving. "Hold the line," Lisa commanded. The squad fought desperately, using every last ounce of strength to keep the shadow at bay as the helicopter descended. The door gunner opened fire with tracer rounds, illuminating the night and driving the shadow back momentarily. Lisa waved the squad toward the chopper. "Go, go," she shouted. One by one, they climbed aboard. Jake was the last, helping Tony up before jumping in himself. The chopper lifted off just as the shadow surged forward, reaching for them with massive, clawed tendrils. As they flew away, Jake looked back. The shadow loomed over the village, its eyes glowing with malevolent fury. "This isn't over," he muttered. Lisa nodded grimly, not by a long shot. The helicopter's engine roared as it carried the battered squad back toward Fob Rattler. No one spoke. The memory of the shadow's towering form and the screams of their missing comrades weighed heavily on them. Jake Wilkins sat near the open door, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The desert stretched endlessly below, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. "We left it behind, right?" Private Tony Ramirez asked, breaking the silence. His voice was a mix of hope and fear. Sergeant Lisa Crow didn't answer immediately. Her jaw tightened as she glanced at the empty seat where Ethan Hayes once sat. "I don't know, Ramirez, but we're going to find out." The helicopter touched down at FOB Rattler just before dawn. The base, usually bustling with activity, felt unusually still. The soldiers disembarked, dragging their gear with them, and were met by Lieutenant Harper, who frowned at their disheveled appearance. "Report, Sergeant," Harper ordered. Lisa saluted but hesitated. "It's complicated, sir. Something out there isn't natural. We lost men, and the mission didn't go as planned." Harper's expression darkened. "We'll debrief later. Get some rest." Jake looked back at the helicopter as its blades powered down. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a flicker of darkness near the tail, but when he blinked, it was gone. That night, the base felt wrong. The usual hum of generators and distant chatter was replaced by an oppressive silence. Jake lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, when he heard it, the whispers. He shot upright, his heart racing. The sound was faint at first, like whine through a narrow passage, but it grew louder, forming words he couldn't understand. "Not again," he muttered, grabbing his rifle. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the barracks. Other soldiers stirred, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Tony burst into the room, his eyes wide. "Jake, it's here. I saw it near the motor pool." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear and followed Tony into the night. Outside, the air was thick with tension. Shadows seemed to dance at the edges of the floodlights, flickering unnaturally. Lisa met them near the motor pool, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "I've got men reporting sightings all over the base. We need to lock this place down." Jake pointed toward the shadows. "It's not going to stop. We need to face it." Lisa's jaw tightened. "And how do you fight something that can't be killed?" The answer came from Jimmy Nguyen, the squad's interpreter, who had been poring over the journal they recovered from the village. He approached with a grim expression. "The journal said fire is the only way to weaken it," Jimmy explained. "But there's more. It's tied to the land. Yes, but it can latch onto people too. It feeds on fear and despair." "So, it's inside the base now," Tony said, his voice trembling. "Great." Jimmy nodded. "We have to trap it. If we can lure it to one place and burn it, we might have a chance to destroy it." Lisa looked at the group. "Then we make a stand. We'll use the supply depot, plenty of fuel and open space." The squad worked quickly, dousing the supply depot with fuel and setting up torches. The whispers grew louder, the shadow's presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. Suddenly, the lights across the base flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. "It's here," Jake whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. From the shadows, the figure emerged, larger than before, its glowing eyes burned with malice. Tendrils of darkness snaked toward them, extinguishing the torches one by one. "Light it up," Lisa shouted. Jake and Tony ignited more torches, creating a barrier of fire. The shadow recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing scream that made the ground tremble. As the creature writhed, Lisa and Jimmy worked to draw it toward the center of the depot. The shadow lashed out, knocking Tony to the ground. Jake rushed to his side, dragging him back behind the fire line. "I'm good," Tony groaned, clutching his side. "Just light the damn thing up." Lisa gave the signal, and Jake threw a lit torch onto the fuel-soaked ground. The depot erupted in flames, the intense heat forcing them to retreat. The shadow screamed, its form twisting and contorting as the fire consumed it. For a moment, it looked like it was gone. But then, from within the flames, the shadow surged forward, larger and more menacing than ever. Lisa screamed, "Fall back, we'll make our stand here." Jake turned to Jimmy. "The journal, there has to be more. What aren't you telling us?" Jimmy hesitated, then shouted over the roar of the flames. "It can't be destroyed, only contained. We need to seal it." "Seal it how?" Lisa demanded. Jimmy pointed to the perimeter of the depot. "We need to surround it with fire and keep it there until sunrise. The light will drive it back." The squad worked frantically, using every bit of fuel they had to create a ring of fire around the shadow. The creature thrashed and howled, but the flames held it in place. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the shadow began to shrink, its form dissolving into the light. The whispers faded, and the oppressive weight lifted. Jake collapsed to the ground, exhausted. "Is it gone?" Jimmy shook his head. "Not gone, just buried. It'll come back if we let the fear grow again." The squad returned to the barracks, their faces pale but determined. Lisa looked at her team, her voice firm. "We survived because we stood together. And we'll keep standing, no matter what." Jake glanced back at the smoldering depot. Deep down, he knew the shadow wasn't truly defeated, but for now, they had won. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.